The museum curator adjusted his glasses, confidently telling the crowd that the soldiers in the 1944 photograph were unidentified ghosts lost to history. He didn't notice the frail 98-year-old man trembling in his wheelchair. The old man didn't see ghosts. He saw his brothers, and he remembered every single name. The polished marble floors of the grand exhibition hall squeaked beneath the rubber wheels of Arthur Pendleton's chair. At 98 years old, Arthur's body was a map of ailments: arthritis that gnarled his hands, a persistent cough, and a left leg that hadn't worked quite right since the winter of 1944. But his mind was a steel trap, entirely untouched by the rust of time. His grandniece, Clara, pushed his wheelchair gently through the winding corridors of the newly opened Shadows of the Ardennes exhibit at the state's premier historical museum. The walls were painted a somber slate grey, and the lighting was kept intentionally low, casting long, dramatic shadows over glass display cases housing rusted M1 Garand rifles, frayed wool coats, and battered canteens. To the wealthy donors and history enthusiasts wandering the hall, it was a profound educational experience. To Arthur, it was a sanitized graveyard. There was no smell of burning diesel. There was no coppery stench of blood or the suffocating odor of unwashed bodies pressed together in frozen foxholes. The museum pumped in climate-controlled, filtered air at a comfortable 72 degrees. Arthur pulled his beige cardigan tighter around his frail shoulders. He hadn't felt truly warm in 78 years. "Are you doing all right, Uncle Artie?" Clara asked softly, leaning down. "We can take a break at the cafe if this is too much." Arthur slowly shook his head, his pale blue eyes fixed on a massive canvas map detailing the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes forest, the Battle of the Bulge. "Keep walking, Clara," he rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "I want to see what they got wrong." Clara smiled a sad-knowing smile and continued pushing. A few yards ahead, a large crowd had gathered in the center of the exhibition space. They formed a tight semicircle around a towering, beautifully framed photograph, blown up to the size of a billboard. Standing in front of it was Dr. Richard Hayes, the museum's chief curator. Hayes was in his late 30s, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, possessing the smooth, resonant voice of a man who loved the sound of his own historical authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could draw your attention to the centerpiece of our gallery," Hayes announced, his voice carrying easily over the hushed murmurs of the crowd. He gestured dramatically to the photograph behind him. Arthur's wheelchair rolled to a halt at the back of the crowd. He peered through the gap between two tall men in overcoats to see the image. It was a stark, haunting, black-and-white photograph. It showed 9 American soldiers huddled around a pathetic, smokeless fire in a dense, snow-choked pine forest. Their faces were hollowed out by exhaustion, smeared with soot and grime. Their helmets were covered in a dusting of snow, and their eyes held the unmistakable 1,000-yard stare of men who had seen the gates of hell and were waiting for them to open again. Arthur's breath hitched. His gnarled hands gripped the armrests of his wheelchair with sudden, white-knuckled ferocity. His heart, normally beating with a slow, measured rhythm, began to hammer wildly against his ribs. "This photograph," Dr. Hayes continued, clasping his hands behind his back, "was discovered just 3 years ago, folded inside a waterproof map case in the floorboards of a ruined farmhouse near Bastogne. It is a masterpiece of raw, unfiltered war photography." Hayes paused for dramatic effect, allowing the tragic silence of the image to wash over his audience. Several people in the crowd took out their phones to snap pictures of it. "However," Hayes said, his tone dropping to a somber whisper, "it is also a profound tragedy. Extensive research by our team, in collaboration with the National Archives, has yielded nothing about the identities of these men. The unit insignia on their coats are obscured by snow and mud. There are no distinctive markings, no dog tags visible. According to military historians, this sector was completely overrun by the German 5th Panzer Army on December 18, 1944. These men, these phantoms of the forest, were entirely wiped out. They are officially listed as unidentified, presumed killed in action, their names lost to the great, unforgiving void of history. A woman near the front dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. A local journalist furiously scribbled notes on a pad. Hayes beamed with quiet pride at the emotional reaction he was eliciting. At the back of the crowd, Arthur's chest heaved. A sharp, stinging sensation built behind his eyes. He wasn't looking at phantoms. He wasn't looking at unidentified historical artifacts. He was looking at Tommy. He was looking at Smitty. He was looking at the boys he had bled with, frozen with, and wept for. "Clara," Arthur whispered, his voice suddenly sharp and commanding. "Push me to the front." "Uncle Artie?" she asked, surprised by the sudden iron in his tone. "The tour guide is still speaking." "I don't care," Arthur snapped, his eyes locked on the towering faces of his past. "Push me to the front. Now!" Clara hesitated for a fraction of a second before gently parting the crowd. "Excuse me. Pardon us, please. Excuse me." The crowd murmured in mild annoyance as the wheelchair bumped through their ranks, but upon seeing the frail, fierce-looking old man wearing a faded 28th Infantry Division cap, they stepped aside. Arthur broke through to the front of the semicircle just as Dr. Hayes was winding up his speech. "And so we leave this photograph untitled," Hayes said, gesturing to the brass plaque beneath the picture that read, simply, "Unknown Squad, Ardennes, December 1944. A testament to the nameless heroes who gave their tomorrows for our todays." "You've got the date wrong, son," a raspy, gravelly voice echoed through the quiet hall. Dr. Hayes blinked, losing his train of thought. He looked down and saw Arthur sitting in his wheelchair, mere feet from the velvet rope. The curator offered a polite, practiced smile. "I'm sorry, sir. Did you have a question? We'll be doing a Q&A at the end of the—" "I didn't ask a question," Arthur interrupted, his voice steadying, growing louder. He reached for his wooden cane, propping it against the floor. With a groan of sheer willpower, Arthur pushed himself out of his wheelchair. "Uncle Artie, don't!" Clara reached for him, but Arthur waved her off. He stood completely upright, ignoring the agonizing fire in his left leg. "I said you have the date wrong," Arthur said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the photograph. "And you have the location wrong, and they aren't nameless." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the gallery. The wealthy donors exchanged bewildered glances. The journalist raised his camera, sensing an unexpected story. Dr. Hayes maintained his professional composure, though a flicker of annoyance crossed his face. He dealt with armchair historians and eccentric veterans often, men who had read a few Stephen Ambrose books and suddenly thought they knew more than the archives. "Sir, I assure you," Hayes said, his tone bordering on patronizing, "this photograph was subjected to rigorous forensic analysis. The shadows cast by the trees, the specific type of winter gear. It all aligns perfectly with the meteorological data of the Bastogne sector on December 18th. Arthur didn't even look at the curator. He stepped right up to the velvet rope, his watery blue eyes tracing the soot-stained faces on the massive canvas. His hand, trembling with age, reached out as if trying to touch the frozen mud. It wasn't December 18th, Arthur said quietly, yet the acoustics of the room carried his voice to every corner. It was January 3rd, 1945. It was 3 miles northeast of Noville. The temperature was exactly 12 degrees below zero. I know, because the spit froze on our lips before it hit the ground. Hayes forced a chuckle, looking out at the crowd to share the joke. Well, memory is a tricky thing after so many decades, sir. But the War Department's official records— To hell with your records, Arthur snapped, turning his head to glare at the curator. The sheer, terrifying intensity in the old man's eyes made Hayes physically take a step backward. Arthur turned back to the photograph. He raised his cane, pointing its rubber tip toward the soldier on the far left, a burly man with a crooked helmet, chewing on an unlit cigar. 30 seconds, Arthur muttered. Excuse me? Hayes asked. You said they were lost to history, Arthur said, his voice rising, filling the room with the raw, undisputed authority of a man who had lived through the nightmare. I'll give them back to you in 30 seconds. Write this down, Mr. Curator. Arthur pointed at the man with the cigar. That's Corporal Thomas Delaney. We called him Priest because he swore more than any man in Pennsylvania, but he kept a silver rosary tucked in his left boot. He had a wife named Mary and a baby girl he never got to meet. The crowd gasped. The journalist began writing furiously. Arthur moved his cane to the next man, a tall, gaunt soldier, staring blankly into the fire. That's Private First Class William Billy Harrison, from Scranton. He had a stutter when the artillery started falling. It was always falling. He owed me $3 from a poker game in London. He never paid me back. Dr. Hayes's face flushed red. He pulled a sleek digital tablet from his jacket pocket, his thumbs flying across the screen as he accessed the museum's comprehensive database. Sir, please, you are disrupting the tour. As I said, there were no survivors from the 110th Infantry in this specific sector. It is historically impossible for you to identify. Next to him, Arthur continued, his voice cracking with emotion, cutting right over the curator. He pointed to a young boy in the center of the photo, his face half hidden by the collar of his coat, looking away from the camera. Arthur's hand began to shake violently. Tears welled up in his eyes, spilling over his wrinkled cheeks. That's Private Samuel Jenkins. We called him Smitty. He lied to the recruiters in Ohio. He was only 17 years old. Arthur leaned heavily on his cane, the memories crashing down on him like a physical weight. The sterile walls of the museum faded away. He could hear the deafening crack of the German 88mm artillery shells splintering the pine trees. He could smell the burning wood and frozen blood. Smitty was terrified, Arthur whispered, the crowd leaning in. Completely spellbound by the devastating intimacy of the old man's words. He cried for his mother at night. He died exactly 3 hours after this picture was taken. Shrapnel caught him in the neck. I held my hands over the wound. I tried to keep the blood in, but it was so cold. It just turned to ice. A woman in the front row let out a muffled sob. Clara stepped forward, tears streaming down her own face, placing a gentle hand on Arthur's back. Dr. Hayes was sweating now. His academic pride was clashing violently with the scene unfolding before him. He stared at his tablet. He found the casualty reports for January 1945. He cross-referenced the names the old man had just spoken. Delaney, Thomas, KIA. Harrison, William, KIA. Jenkins, Samuel, KIA. Hayes's breath caught in his throat. The names were real. The casualty dates matched January 3rd, 1945. But the curator's mind, rigidly trained to trust paper over people, desperately clung to the official narrative. This is an incredible coincidence, Hayes stammered, his voice lacking its previous booming confidence. Or perhaps you've read up on the casualty lists, sir. But it doesn't change the forensic fact. The unit was wiped out. There is no historical record of any soldier surviving that specific skirmish to bring this photograph back. The man who took this picture died with them. Arthur slowly turned to face Dr. Hayes. The old veteran's eyes were no longer watery. They were cold, hard, and piercing. He reached into the inner pocket of his beige cardigan. His trembling fingers pulled out a small, tarnished silver object attached to a faded green lanyard. He tossed it onto the glass display case beside Dr. Hayes. It landed with a heavy, metallic clink. It was a dog tag. "Read it," Arthur commanded. Hayes, hands shaking slightly, picked up the dog tag. He read the stamped metal out loud, his voice barely above a whisper. Pendleton, Arthur J. Blood, Type O. Religion, Protestant. "I know there is no historical record of a survivor, Dr. Hayes," Arthur said, the sheer weight of his 78 years of survivor's guilt echoing in every syllable. "Because when the panzers broke through the tree line, Priest shoved me into a mortar crater and piled the 3 dead bodies on top of me to hide me from the SS patrols. I lay under the frozen corpses of my best friends for 2 days. The entire exhibition hall was dead silent. The only sound was the hum of the climate control system and the quiet weeping of the crowd. Arthur looked back up at the towering photograph, his expression softening into one of agonizing sorrow. "There was one survivor," Arthur whispered, pointing a trembling finger at the smudge in the bottom right corner of the photograph, a smudge Hayes had previously identified as a defect in the film. "That smudge right there," Arthur said, his voice breaking. "That's my thumb, because I'm the one who took the damn picture." The air in the museum had grown thick, the climate-controlled chill entirely replaced by a heavy, reverent warmth radiating from the captivated crowd. "Doctor." Richard Hayes stood frozen, the metal of Arthur's dog tag pressing into his palm. It felt unnaturally heavy, as if it carried the physical weight of the 78 years of grief Arthur had dragged behind him. The curator's sleek digital tablet slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the polished marble floor. He didn't even flinch. Arthur Pendleton did not lower his cane. His hand, previously shaking with the frailty of a near centenarian, was now locked in place, fueled by a surge of adrenaline and a sacred duty he had deferred for over 7 decades. He moved the rubber tip of his cane to a figure seated on an overturned ammunition crate on the right side of the frame. The soldier was hunched over, his hands wrapped around a dented tin cup. "That is Sergeant David Cooper," Arthur stated, his voice a steady, rhythmic drumbeat against the silence of the gallery. "We called him Coop. He was from a little neighborhood in Chicago. He didn't carry a Bible, and he didn't carry a girl's picture. He carried a photograph of a stray golden retriever he'd adopted 3 weeks before he shipped out. Coop used to say that if he didn't make it back, the dog was the only one who wouldn't understand why." He was 24. Arthur swallowed hard, the dry click in his throat audible in the hushed room. He moved the cane to the next face, a boy with a bandaged hand resting on his knee. Private John McAllister, a farm boy from outside Des Moines, Iowa. Mac had hands the size of dinner plates, but he had the gentlest soul of any man in the 110th. He was the one who found that extra ration of coffee we were drinking in the picture. He traded a captured German Luger to a supply clerk for it. He wanted us to have one last hot drink before the sun went down. Mac never saw the sun come up again. A sniper caught him when he tried to drag Smitty to cover. Dr. Hayes slowly reached into his breast pocket. He bypassed his phone and withdrew a small, leather-bound notebook and a silver fountain pen. His hands were trembling now. He clicked the pen, stepped closer to the velvet rope, and began to write furiously. He wasn't acting as a curator anymore. He was a scribe, taking dictation from the only living primary source left in the world. Next to Mac, Arthur continued, his eyes softening as he pointed to a soldier with a red cross barely visible on his snow-caked helmet, is Corporal Peter Russo, our medic, Brooklyn-born and raised. Peter was always tired because he never slept. If you had a blister, a cough, or a missing limb, Peter was there. He wanted to go to medical school after the war. When the panzers hit us, Peter didn't take cover. He ran straight into the artillery barrage with his medical kit. He was blown to pieces trying to save a man who was already dead. A woman in a designer coat at the front of the crowd dropped to her knees, openly weeping into her hands. The journalist's camera hung forgotten around his neck. He was staring at Arthur, with his mouth slightly ajar, wiping his own eyes with the back of his sleeve. Clara stood closely behind her great-uncle, her hands hovering near his shoulders, ready to catch him if his failing body finally surrendered to the emotional toll. But Arthur was immovable. And the man standing in the back, the one looking at the sky, Arthur's voice dropped to a reverent, aching whisper. That is Lieutenant James Miller. He was our commanding officer. He was 26, but to us he was an old man. He kept us together when the winter tried to tear us apart. Arthur paused, lowering his cane slightly. He looked down at his own gnarled, arthritis-ridden hands. Lieutenant Miller is the reason that photograph exists, Arthur explained, his voice thick with the ghosts of 1945. He found a Leica camera in a ruined German command post 2 days prior. It had one exposure left on the roll. When we stopped to boil that coffee, the lieutenant handed it to me. He said, "Pendleton, you've got a steady hand. Take a picture of the boys. When we get to Paris, we'll develop it and send it to our mothers." So I took the camera. I stepped back. I held my breath to keep my hands from shaking in the cold, and I pressed the shutter. Arthur's chest rose and fell with a ragged breath. The memory was pulling him under, dragging him back to the icy mud of the Ardennes. "I put the camera in my map case," Arthur said, the tears finally flowing freely down his cheeks, pooling in the deep wrinkles of his face. 3 hours later, the tree line exploded. The German offensive hit us like a freight train. There were hundreds of them, and 9 of us. Priest, Corporal Delaney, grabbed me by the collar and threw me into a crater. He dragged Mac and Coop over me. Their blood leaked through my coat. I lay there in the freezing mud, unable to move, unable to breathe, listening to my brothers die. I listened to the Germans walking through the snow, firing into the bodies to make sure we were dead. Arthur squeezed his eyes shut, gripping the velvet rope to stay upright. I lay there for 2 days. When the American reinforcements finally pushed them back and found me, my legs were frozen solid. They took me to a field hospital. I lost my map case in the chaos. I thought the camera was gone forever. I thought the last memory of my brothers was buried in the snow. Until today. For a long, agonizing moment, there was no sound in the exhibition hall, but the muffled sobs of the spectators. The grandeur of the museum had been completely stripped away, leaving only the raw, bleeding edge of human reality. The photograph was no longer a piece of art. It was a tombstone. And Arthur Pendleton was the sole surviving mourner. Slowly, Dr. Hayes closed his leather notebook. He stepped around the velvet rope, crossing the boundary between the untouchable history on the walls and the living history standing before him. The curator, a man who had built his entire career on academic superiority and peer-reviewed journals, stood directly in front of the wheelchair-bound veteran. Without a word, Dr. Hayes bowed his head. "Mr. Pendleton," Hayes began, his voice cracking, devoid of any of its previous theatrical polish. "I have spent my life studying the Second World War. I have read thousands of action reports, analyzed endless data, and curated hundreds of artifacts. I thought I understood the Ardennes. I thought I knew what happened there." Hayes looked up, his eyes rimmed with red. "I knew absolutely nothing. You have my deepest, most profound apologies, sir. I was arrogant, and I was wrong." Arthur looked at the young curator. The fierce, terrifying intensity in the old man's eyes slowly faded, replaced by a deep, hollow exhaustion. The adrenaline was leaving him, and the 98 years of gravity were returning to his bones. "I don't want your apology, son," Arthur said gently, his voice returning to a raspy whisper. "I just want their names on the wall." "You have my word," Hayes said without hesitation. He turned to look at the massive photograph. "By tomorrow morning, the plaque will be recast. This exhibit will no longer be called Shadows of the Ardennes. We will rename it, and every single man in this photograph will have his name, his rank, and his hometown displayed beneath him. They will never be unidentified again." Arthur nodded slowly. The heavy, invisible chain he had carried around his neck since January 3rd, 1945, finally shattered. He had been spared in the crater not by luck, but for a purpose. Priest had saved him so that he could live long enough to stand in this room, 78 years later, and give them back to the world. His knees buckled. "Uncle Artie!" Clara cried out, rushing forward. "Doctor!" Hayes instantly dropped his notebook and caught Arthur by the opposite arm, helping Clara ease the old man back into his wheelchair. Arthur sank into the vinyl seat, his breathing shallow but steady. He looked frail again, a tiny man swallowed up by a beige cardigan. But as he looked up at the photograph one last time, a faint, peaceful smile touched his lips. The soot-stained faces of Priest, Billy, Smitty, Coop, Mac, Peter, and Lieutenant Miller stared back down at him from the canvas. They were no longer phantoms. They were no longer lost to the void. "Rest easy, boys," Arthur whispered, resting his trembling hands in his lap. "You're going home." Slowly, spontaneously, the journalist at the back of the crowd began to clap. It wasn't a loud, raucous applause, but a slow, rhythmic striking of hands out of sheer, overwhelming respect. The woman in the designer coat joined in. Then the wealthy donors. Within seconds, the entire gallery was applauding, a gentle wave of reverence washing over the old veteran. They parted down the middle, creating a wide, clear path to the exit, standing like an honor guard. Clara wiped her face with a tissue, gave Dr. Hayes a tearful smile of gratitude, and gripped the handles of the wheelchair. She turned Arthur away from the photograph, pushing him slowly down the aisle of clapping strangers. Arthur didn't look back. He didn't need to. For the first time in his long, haunted life, the silence of the snow had finally been broken. History isn't just ink on a page. It's the heartbeat of those who lived it. If Arthur's incredible journey to reclaim his brothers' names moved you, please hit that like button and share this story with your friends. Don't let the memories of our true heroes fade into the unknown. Subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable, real-life stories that remind us of the enduring power of the human spirit. Thank you for watching and honoring their legacy.